He came home with perfume on his collar and a woman on his arm, and Claire had spent 3 days decorating every corner of that house for his birthday. The cake was still warm on the counter. The banner still hung crooked over the door because she'd climbed the chair alone to put it there. 37 candles. One for every year of the man she had loved since she was too young to know what love even cost. Then Ethan Moretti walked through that door with Vivian Caldwell's lipstick on his jaw, introduced her as his fiancée, and told Claire, in front of the woman who was already studying her like a pest to be removed, to call him Mr. Moretti from now on. Claire didn't scream. She didn't throw the cake. She just stood there holding the lighter she'd been about to use on those 37 candles, and felt something go very quiet inside her chest. If that were you, standing in a room you'd spent 3 days making beautiful, holding a flame for someone who just handed his heart to someone else, what would you do? If this story already has your pulse up, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the woman who disappeared becomes the only thing a powerful man can't find, no matter how far his reach extends. The morning of Ethan Moretti's 37th birthday started the way Claire Whitmore had planned it for 6 weeks. She was up before 5. That wasn't unusual. Her mind had always run ahead of her body, chasing calculations and star charts, and the particular quiet of early morning when the apartment felt entirely her own. But that Saturday, she wasn't thinking about astrophysics. She was thinking about the banner she'd ordered online and the way it had arrived slightly misprinted, "Happy Birthday, Ita." So she'd fixed the missing N herself with a black marker, which meant if you looked closely, you could still see the difference in ink thickness. She'd decided to hang it anyway because it felt more honest that way, more like something made by a real person rather than purchased perfection. She spent the first hour arranging the living room. Ethan's penthouse had always felt like a hotel lobby to her, beautiful and expensive and completely indifferent to whoever happened to be living in it. She'd been trying to fix that for 16 years, one small gesture at a time. A plant here, a photograph there, a throw blanket over the arm of the leather couch because leather is cold, and Ethan, whatever his reputation suggested, got cold. The cake took 2 hours. Chocolate with espresso buttercream because she knew his exact preference and had known it since she was 11 years old and had watched him push aside a perfectly decent vanilla slice at some business dinner, not complaining, just quietly not eating it. She'd filed that away. She'd filed away a lot of things about Ethan Moretti over 16 years. By noon, the apartment smelled like sugar and coffee, and something green from the eucalyptus she'd clipped from the arrangement on the dining table. She stood back and looked at all of it. The banner, the cake under its glass dome, the small wrapped package on the side table that contained a first edition copy of a book she'd spent 4 months tracking down, because he'd mentioned exactly once, casually, that his father used to read it aloud on Sunday mornings before everything went wrong. She'd remembered that. Of course she'd remembered. Claire was 24 years old and finishing her doctorate in astrophysics, and capable of running orbital calculations in her head while holding a conversation about something else entirely. But standing in that decorated living room with flowers still faintly dusted on her left wrist, she felt closer to 14 than 24. She felt the same thing she'd been feeling for years and kept reclassifying as gratitude or admiration or simple loyalty, whatever word was safest to use. She told herself it was gratitude. She had been telling herself that for a while. Ethan had said he would be home by 6. He was not home by 6. She sat at the kitchen island at 6:15 and scrolled through her phone without reading anything. She checked the elevator indicator out of habit. She straightened the fork beside the cake plate even though it was already straight. At 6:40 she sent a text that said only, "Running late?" Not accusatory. She knew his world didn't run on anyone's schedule, but its own. He didn't respond. She ate a small piece of the cake standing at the counter at 7 o'clock because she'd skipped lunch and her hands were starting to feel slightly distant from her body. It was good. The espresso came through exactly the way she'd wanted. She covered the rest back under the dome and turned the kitchen light down and sat on the couch under the throw blanket and opened her laptop to the Project Horizon application materials she'd been meaning to review for 2 days. She told herself she wasn't waiting. She was just present in the apartment where she happened to also be waiting. At 8:50, she heard the elevator. She closed the laptop and stood up and smoothed the front of her sweater. Dark green, the one she'd put on deliberately because Ethan had said once, 3 years ago, that the color suited her, and she had remembered that too, which was either touching or embarrassing depending on how honest she was feeling about herself. The elevator doors opened. Ethan walked in first. He was wearing his dark charcoal jacket, and his shoulders were doing the thing they did when he'd been tense for hours and was only now beginning to release it. Claire noticed all of this in the first half second because she had spent 16 years learning to read Ethan Moretti the way other people read weather. Then she saw the woman behind him. Vivian Caldwell was exactly the kind of beautiful that announced itself before it walked into a room. Tall, composed, wearing something ivory that looked like it had been made for her body specifically, hair arranged in a way that suggested effort while appearing effortless. She stepped off the elevator and took in the decorated apartment with an expression that managed to be politely appreciative and subtly dismissive at the same time, the way someone looks at a child's drawing displayed on a refrigerator. Claire's first thought, absurdly, was the banner. The hand-corrected N. "You're home," she said to Ethan. Her voice came out steady enough. "Yeah." I was already scanning the apartment, taking in the decorations without quite landing on them. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it because she had never seen that particular expression on him before. "This is Vivian." Vivian turned the appreciative smile directly onto Claire. It was a practice smile, the kind that said, "I've already assessed you, and I'm choosing to be gracious about what I found." "You must be Claire," Vivian said. "Ethan's mentioned you." "Has he?" Not a question. Claire wasn't sure what it was. "We have something to tell you," Ethan said. She looked at him. He was not looking at the cake. He was not looking at the banner or the wrapped package or any of the things she'd spent 6 weeks arranging. He was looking at her with an expression she finally recognized because she'd seen it before. It was the expression Ethan Moretti wore when he had already decided something and was now managing the announcement of it. He reached out and took Vivian's hand. "Vivian and I are engaged." The words sat in the air between them like something thrown. Claire didn't move. Her body understood before her mind caught up. Her chest did something that felt like a door closing, not slamming, just swinging shut on its hinges with a soft, definitive click. She was aware distantly of the 37 candles still unlit in the cake dome, of the marker-corrected banner hanging slightly crooked over the door. "Congratulations," she said. The word came out clear. She was a little surprised. "Claire." His voice had a different quality now, lower. She would think about that later and wonder what it meant. "I need you to understand something." "Ethan." Vivian's hand tightened briefly on his. "From now on," he said, "I need you to call me Mr. Moretti." The apartment was very quiet. Claire looked at him for a long moment. 16 years of shared meals and private jokes, and the particular silence that existed between two people who had survived things together. 16 years of him knowing exactly how she took her tea, and her knowing which nightmares made him wake up before dawn and sit in the kitchen not wanting to be alone. 16 years of her telling herself that what she felt was gratitude. "Mr. Moretti," she repeated. He didn't flinch. He held her gaze and his eyes were steady and careful, and she hated him for a single scorching second in a way she'd never hated anyone, because she could see that he'd prepared himself for this moment, and she had not. Vivian was looking between them with the polite, watchful attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had already decided how to use it. "I think that's very mature," Vivian said pleasantly. "Families evolve. Everyone finds their new position." Families evolve. Claire had grown up without parents. She'd grown up in this man's house, and in the margins of his life, and in the careful space he'd maintained between what she was to him and what she'd hoped she might be. And this woman, who had known her for 90 seconds, was explaining to her how families evolve. "I should let you both celebrate," Claire said. "I need to check on some research materials." She walked to her room. She closed the door. She stood in the dark for a moment with her back against the wood and her eyes on the ceiling and her hands hanging at her sides. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and opened her laptop and stared at the Project Horizon application without reading it. In the living room, she could hear Vivian's voice, low and melodic. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. The unlit candles, the corrected banner, the book she'd spent 4 months finding, Mr. Moretti. She opened the application. She began to read. Over the next 3 weeks, Vivian Caldwell installed herself in the apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always planned to be there. She brought things slowly, piece by piece. A coat one day, a set of toiletries the next, a framed photograph of herself and Ethan at some event that appeared on the mantelpiece one morning without announcement. She redecorated the bathroom without asking. She replaced the throw blanket with a different one. Claire watched all of this without commenting because what would she say and to whom? She began spending most of her time in the university labs, arriving before anyone else and staying until the building's heating system cycled down and the corridors got cold. She slept at the apartment because her things were there, and because she had nowhere else to go, and because she was not yet ready to admit what she was preparing for. Vivian had a gift for architecture, not physical architecture, social architecture. She understood the load-bearing walls of a situation, and she knew exactly which ones to remove to make a structure collapse gracefully. She began with small things. A comment about Claire's research that was technically supportive, but implied a certain charmed amateurism. "It's so wonderful that you love your work this much." A remark about Claire's presence at dinner that framed it as a kind of tolerance. "We're happy to include you, of course." A raised eyebrow when Claire spoke directly to Ethan about anything that wasn't logistical. Ethan said nothing. That was the thing Claire kept returning to in the lab at 2 in the morning with the calculations going blurry on her screen. He said nothing. He watched Vivian with an expression that gave away nothing. Not discomfort, not endorsement, not apology. He had become, since the night of the birthday party, a man she did not recognize. Not cold exactly, but sealed. Like all the doors she'd thought she knew had been locked from the inside. She called him Ethan once by accident, 3 days after the announcement, and watched something flicker across his face before he said quietly, "Mr. Moretti, please, Claire." She had nodded and walked out of the room and stood in the hallway for 30 seconds, gripping her own elbows before continuing on. She did not call him Ethan again. The application for Project Horizon sat in her drafts for 11 days before she completed it. It was a one-way mission. That was the thing she kept having to reread because some part of her brain kept smoothing it over. One way, meaning no planned return, meaning the crew would spend the rest of their lives in deep space pursuing what her parents had spent their lives dreaming about. Her mother had kept a photograph on her desk. Earth from lunar orbit, that particular curve of blue light against black. Claire had carried the photograph in her wallet since she was 8 years old. It was worn soft at the edges. She submitted the application on a Tuesday morning, sitting in a corner booth at a coffee shop near campus, wearing the green sweater. She pressed send and then sat very still with both hands wrapped around her cup and waited to feel something conclusive. She felt instead a kind of low-grade vertigo, like stepping off a curb that was slightly higher than expected. She didn't tell anyone. 3 days later, a man named Noah Carter introduced himself at a Project Horizon information session with the energy of someone who found everything about the world genuinely interesting. He was an astronaut candidate, ex-military, with a face that had clearly spent years outdoors and a manner that suggested he'd never once tried to seem more impressive than he actually was. He shook her hand and asked what her research focus was and actually listened to the answer. "Gravitational anomalies," she said. "Edge cases. Places where the models don't quite fit the data." "Those are always the interesting parts," he said. "The places where the models break down." She liked him immediately. She hadn't expected to like anyone for a while. It was Noah who found her 6 weeks later, sitting in her car outside the apartment building at 11:30 at night, unable to go upstairs. She hadn't told him what had happened. She'd only said that something at home was complicated. He'd picked up his phone on the second ring and talked to her through the window of his truck, parked beside her, for 2 hours about everything except what was wrong, and then said, "You don't have to explain. Just don't sleep in your car." She hadn't told him what was wrong because she wasn't certain she had the language for it yet. What had happened that evening was that Vivian had found the journals. Claire's parents had left behind 3 notebooks filled with research. Handwritten, meticulous, the foundation of work that she had been quietly building on for years. She kept them in a fireproof box in her closet. She had always kept them there. She had opened her closet that evening to find the box pushed to the back, tilted sideways, and when she opened it, the journals were inside, but they were wrong. Pages bent, one binding cracked, water damage along the bottom edge of the second notebook that hadn't been there before. She'd carried the damaged journal to the living room. She'd held it up. She'd asked, very carefully, what had happened. Vivian had glanced at the journal with mild recognition. She'd said the closet needed to be reorganized, and she'd moved things around, and perhaps something had spilled. She wasn't sure. She hadn't realized it was important. Claire had looked at Ethan. Ethan had looked at the journal, and then at Vivian, and then at Claire, and he had said, "We can get them restored." She had put the journal back in the box and gone downstairs to her car and sat there until Noah picked up the phone. The next morning, she began the process of packing. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly, the way she did everything she needed to be certain about. One careful decision at a time. She gathered the jewelry first. Every piece Ethan had ever given her. The silver bracelet for her 12th birthday, the earrings he'd brought back from somewhere overseas, the necklace she'd worn to her undergraduate thesis defense because she'd been so nervous and it had felt like wearing something solid. She put them in a small bag. She looked up 3 different jewelers before selecting one, wanting to be fair in what she asked for them. She withdrew the money over several weeks so it wouldn't look like anything. She found the account number he'd been depositing into for her education and her stipend and her expenses for 16 years, and she transferred back every dollar she could account for, to the cent, which took her 3 days of reconstruction from bank statements. She wrote the letter last. She wrote it 7 times. The first 6 were wrong in different ways. Too angry, too explanatory, too much like asking for something. The 7th was 4 sentences. I am leaving to pursue the mission my parents devoted their lives to. I understand this wasn't the future you planned for me. Everything you gave me, I've returned. Thank you for 16 years. She did not sign it, Claire. She signed it C. Whitmore. She walked out of the apartment on a Thursday afternoon with 2 bags and a fireproof box, and got into a cab and gave the driver the address for the Project Horizon training facility. She did not look back at the building, not because she wasn't tempted, because she knew if she looked, she might not leave. 48 hours later, the gates of the facility closed behind her. The program was classified. No outside contact except through approved channels. She handed over her personal phone and received a program device. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Moretti came home to a decorated apartment with no one in it and found a note on the kitchen island that said 4 sentences and was signed with her last name alone. He read it twice. He stood very still in the kitchen for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the island, which was not something Ethan Moretti did. Sit on floors, lose his structural composure, let himself be caught by his knees, and stayed there long enough that the kitchen light cycled through from evening to night around him. He did not go after her that night. He told himself it was better this way. He told himself that every day for the next 3 weeks, with the particular discipline of a man who has learned to make himself believe the things he needs to believe in order to keep moving. He was still telling himself that when his assistant placed a document on his desk and said carefully, "Sir, the Project Horizon final roster. You should see this." He looked at the document. Halfway down the confirmed crew list, in a font no different from any other name on the page, was a name he knew better than his own. Dr. Claire Whitmore, Astrophysics, Mission Specialist. He read it again, and again. The way you reread something that doesn't make sense, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney and said 3 words. Stop the launch. Ethan Moretti did not make requests. He made statements, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. So when he told his attorney to stop the launch, he meant it the way he meant everything, completely, without room for the possibility that it might not happen. He'd built an organization on that certainty. 31 years of decisions made in rooms where hesitation was the most dangerous thing a man could show, and not once had he issued an order that wasn't carried out. Marcus Webb had been his attorney for 19 years. I was a careful man, precise, the kind of lawyer who thought in terms of liability and exposure and the exact weight of words. He listened to Ethan's 3 words on the phone and said nothing for 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than Marcus Webb ever took to respond to anything. Ethan, he said finally, Project Horizon is a federal program. The launch window is in 11 days. You're a private investor, not a... Find the mechanism, Ethan said. I don't care what it costs. He hung up and stood at his office window looking out at the city below him, which was doing what cities did, moving, indifferent, full of people who had no idea that Claire Whitmore had just been placed on a spacecraft that was going to take her away permanently. And he felt something happening in his chest that he had no vocabulary for because he had spent decades making sure he never needed it. His phone rang. Marcus. He picked up. There's a contractual review clause, Marcus said. He was talking fast now, which meant he'd already been working before he called back. Investors above a certain funding threshold can request a mission review if they have documented safety concerns. You qualify. It buys us maybe 72 hours if we file before 9 tomorrow morning. File it. Ethan, I need you to understand, 72 hours is not a solution. It's a delay. The review board will reinstate the launch. And if Claire Whitmore is on that crew by choice, there's no legal mechanism to remove her without her consent. File it, he said again, and find out who altered the roster. There was a brief silence. What? The original roster didn't have her name on it. Someone put it there after the fact. Find out who and find out why, and find out who paid them, and have that information on my desk by morning. He set the phone down and sat behind his desk and opened the mission file he'd been reviewing for months without ever knowing what it actually contained. He read through the crew manifest with the particular attention of a man going through evidence, looking for the seam, the place where the ordinary documentation stopped and something else began. He found it 2 hours later. A logistical amendment dated 6 weeks ago, buried in a staffing appendix, rerouting a crew position from a candidate who had withdrawn for medical reasons to a replacement selected through an accelerated evaluation process. The replacement had no name yet in that version of the document. It had been filled in later. Someone with system access and enough institutional cover to make it look procedural. He called his head of security at midnight. "I need everything on a man named Director Alan Forsyth," he said. "He runs the civilian staffing division for Horizon. I need it by 6. "Yes, sir." He did not sleep. He sat in his office chair with the mission file open and his jacket still on and the city going dark outside the window, and thought about the last time he'd seen Claire's face clearly. Not the careful, neutral expression she'd been maintaining for weeks, but the real one. The one that appeared for half a second after he'd said, "Mr. Moretti, please," and before she'd collected herself and walked out. That half second. He had spent 20 minutes constructing the cruelty of that instruction. Just enough distance, just enough formality to make her angry enough to stop looking at him the way she'd been looking at him, which was the way that made it impossible for him to do what he needed to do, which was push her toward a future that didn't include a mafia boss's shadow over every corner of it. He had not accounted for Vivian misunderstanding her role. He had not accounted for the journals. He put his hands flat on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 16 years. A woman answered on the third ring. Sharp voice, older now. "Ethan Moretti, it's midnight." "I know. I need a favor, Dr. Reyes." "At midnight." "Yes." A pause. The sound of something being set down. "What happened?" "Claire is on the Horizon manifest. Final crew. 11 days. Silence. Then, "Oh, Ethan. Did you know?" "Of course I didn't know. I'm her thesis advisor, not her mission controller. She submitted her application months ago, but I thought..." Dr. Reyes stopped. "She never told you she applied?" "No." "Did you give her a reason to tell you things?" He didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer with. "I need you to talk to her," he said. "She'll see you. She won't take my calls." "You think she should withdraw?" "Yes." "And have you considered," Dr. Reyes said, with the particular precision of a woman who had spent 40 years in science and had no patience left for avoidance, that you don't get to make that decision? She doesn't know what she's walking into. She has a doctorate in astrophysics and an IQ that makes the rest of us look like we're running on backup power. She knows exactly what she's walking into. What you mean is that she doesn't know what you feel because you have apparently made an extraordinary effort to ensure she never found out. A pause. "Am I wrong?" He was quiet. "I'll go see her," Dr. Reyes said. "Not to tell her to withdraw, to make sure she's all right. That's the best I can offer you." She hung up. Ethan set the phone down. He looked at the mission file. 11 days. He had dismantled more complicated things than this. He'd brought down 3 competing organizations, rebuilt 2 legitimate companies from ruins, navigated 17 years of federal scrutiny without a single indictable charge. He was not a man who lost. He picked up the file and began reading from the beginning. At 6:15 the next morning, his security director placed a folder on his desk. Ethan opened it while standing, still in yesterday's jacket, and read it in under 3 minutes. Director Alan Forsyth, 53. Married, 2 kids in college. A civil servant with a 20-year record that was unremarkable in every direction except for a cluster of financial transactions starting 14 months ago. Payments into an account belonging to a shell company registered in Delaware, originating from a source his team hadn't cracked yet, but had narrowed to someone with significant private capital and a specific interest in Project Horizon's crew composition. Someone had paid to put Claire on that mission. The question was whether it was someone trying to help her or someone trying to make sure she disappeared. He called Vivian. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. "Good morning," she said, pleasant as always, the pleasantness sitting like a surface over everything. "Where are you?" he said. A brief pause. "My apartment. I stayed here last night after you. I need you to come in. Ethan, it's 6 in the..." "Now, Vivian." She arrived at 45 minutes past 7 in a cab, wearing something perfectly assembled for someone who'd had 45 minutes, which told him she'd been ready before he called. She sat across from his desk with her hands in her lap, and her expression set to the particular register she used when she was deciding which version of herself to present. He put the Horizon file on the desk between them. "You knew," he said. She looked at the file. Her expression didn't change. That was the tell. If she hadn't known, she would have looked confused. Vivian Caldwell did not do confused. She did controlled. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Someone paid to alter the crew roster. Someone with access to my financial records, specifically the Horizon investment account, and enough familiarity with Claire's application status to know she was an alternate." He watched her face. "I have 14 months of transactions pointing toward a Delaware shell company. My people will have the originating account by end of day." "That doesn't... Did you do this to get her out of my life?" he said. "Or did someone pay you to do it?" The room was very quiet. Vivian uncrossed her legs and recrossed them. She looked at the file and then at Ethan, and she did the thing she rarely did. She dropped the pleasantness. Underneath it, she was something colder and more direct, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had underestimated what she actually was. "You were never going to let her go," Vivian said. "Even with the engagement, even with the distance, you kept her in that apartment, in your orbit, in your life, because you couldn't let yourself commit to either direction. You couldn't keep her the way you actually wanted her, so you kept her the way that let you pretend otherwise. I moved the variable. You put her on a one-way mission. I accelerated a decision she'd already made." Her voice was steady. "She applied, Ethan. She wanted to go. I just ensured she couldn't be talked out of it once you came to your senses." He looked at her for a long time. "Get out of this office," he said. "Ethan, and get your things out of the apartment, today. Have someone else do it if you'd prefer." He picked up the file. "Marcus will handle the formal dissolution." Vivian stood. She picked up her bag. She was still composed, still precise, but there was something different in her posture now. Not hurt, not exactly. Something more like calculation revised, like a move that hadn't played out the way it was meant to. "You're going to spend years trying to fix this," she said at the door. "And you should know. She is exactly as stubborn as you are. More, possibly. She gets it from watching you." She left. He stood in the office and looked at the folder in his hands, and then set it down and walked to the window. The city was fully awake now. Gray winter morning, heavy sky. He thought about the roster amendment. 14 months ago. Vivian had started moving pieces before he'd even made the decision about the engagement, which meant she'd been watching the situation and planning around it for longer than he'd realized, which meant he had badly misjudged both her intelligence and her intention. And Claire was behind a security perimeter he couldn't legally breach with 11 days left on the clock. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Drop the review filing," he said. "What? Ethan, that's our only... It won't work. Even if it delays the launch, she's on the crew voluntarily. 72 hours doesn't change that." He watched a cab navigate a turn 12 stories below. "I need a different approach. I need to get to her directly. She's inside a classified facility. I know that. You can't... I'm the mission's primary private investor, Marcus. Set up a meeting with the program director. Official capacity. I want a stakeholder briefing on final crew selection and mission readiness. Make it sound like due diligence." A pause. "That might get you a meeting. It won't get you alone with her." "It gets me inside the building," Ethan said. "That's enough." The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. He spent those 2 days running down the shell company. His team cracked it on the morning of the second day, and the originating account, when they finally reached it, was not Vivian's. It was an account he recognized, a name he hadn't heard in 4 years. A man named Gerard Hale, who had once been a business associate and had become something else when a deal went wrong and 2 of his people ended up in federal custody. Hale had blamed Ethan. Hale had gone quiet afterward, which Ethan had taken as acceptance. It had not been acceptance. Hale had put Claire on that mission not to help her. He'd done it to ensure Ethan Moretti spent the rest of his life knowing exactly what he'd lost and being completely unable to do anything about it. Vivian had been a pawn. She'd played her own game inside Hale's game without knowing the board she was actually on. Ethan sat with that information for a long time. Then he called his security director and said, "Find Hale. All of him. Every account, every property, every associate. I want a complete picture by tomorrow morning." He went to the facility meeting in a dark suit, no tie, with Marcus and two members of his team. He sat across a conference table from Program Director Lewis and two mission administrators and spent 40 minutes asking the kinds of questions that a major investor was expected to ask: cost overruns, engineering margins, crew psychological evaluations. He was thorough. He was patient. He gave no indication of what he was actually there for. Then he asked to use the restroom and took a wrong turn in the corridor and walked until he found a woman in a gray program uniform coming out of a lab with a tablet under her arm. And he recognized her, Dr. Reyes, who had clearly been here for longer than a single visit. She stopped when she saw him. Her expression said she'd been expecting this. "She knows you're here," Dr. Reyes said quietly. "She told me to tell you she won't meet with you." Something cold moved through his chest. "Then she knows I'm trying." "She knows." Dr. Reyes looked at him, not unkindly, but without softness. "She also knows about Vivian and the roster. Someone told her 2 days ago." "Who?" "I don't know, but knowing it didn't make her want to leave, Ethan. If anything," she paused. "She said it confirmed that her world inside this facility is the first one she's ever been in where her presence wasn't managed by someone who thought they knew better." He absorbed that. "I need 5 minutes with her," he said. "I know you do." "Can you—" "No," Dr. Reyes said, gently but entirely. "I can't arrange that, and if I could, I wouldn't. She made a decision. It's hers." She shifted the tablet under her arm. "What I can tell you is that she's not angry anymore. That's not why she won't come out." "Then why?" Dr. Reyes looked at him for a moment. "Because she said if she sees your face, she might change her mind, and she doesn't want to change her mind." He stood in the corridor of the facility with the fluorescent lights running a flat white above him and felt the sentence land. "If she sees your face, she might change her mind." 16 years. Every calculated distance. Every chosen cruelty. Every time he told himself that keeping her safe meant keeping her away from what he was and what his world contained. All of it, and it came down to this corridor, this fluorescent light. This woman telling him that Claire was 10 minutes away and would not come out because seeing him might undo everything she'd built. He walked back to the conference room. He finished the meeting. He shook hands with Director Lewis and thanked him for his time and walked with Marcus to the car and got in. Marcus said nothing on the way back. He understood, after 19 years, when to do that. Ethan looked out the window and thought about a 24-year-old woman with flour on her wrist and 37 candles she'd never lit, sitting in a classified facility 10 days from a launch that would take her to the edge of what physics thought was possible. He thought about the photograph in her wallet, worn soft at the edges, Earth from lunar orbit, her dead mother's desk. He thought about what he was going to do. He told himself he would find another way. He told himself he had 10 days and the kind of resources that made 10 days feel like longer. He told himself that Ethan Moretti did not run out of moves, but somewhere beneath the discipline and the calculation and the 31 years of making the world arrange itself to his requirements, he felt something he had no framework for, something that tasted like the particular terror of a man who finally understands that the thing he's been protecting has walked past the point where his protection reaches. 9 days before launch, Vivian called him from a number he didn't recognize. He picked up because he had people tracking Hale, and he couldn't afford to miss information. "I didn't know about Hale," she said immediately. No greeting. "I need you to know that. What I did, the roster, I arranged that myself. I had a contact in the administrative division who owed me a favor. I didn't know someone else was working the same angle for different reasons." "I believe you," he said, because he did. Vivian was many things, but she wasn't stupid, and working with Gerard Hale was the kind of stupid that got people removed from the board permanently. "I also need you to know that I meant what I said, about her wanting to go." A pause. "She applied before I did anything. She was already going to leave, Ethan. I just made it irreversible. That's the part I understand if that's unforgivable." "It is," he said. She hung up. He spent the next 7 days calling in every contact he had at the federal level: 4 senators, 2 cabinet-level officials, a retired general who owed him a significant favor from a situation in 2019 that had never been formalized in writing. Each of them listened. Each of them told him some version of the same thing. The mission was too far along, the investment too vast, the crew commitment voluntary and documented. There was no mechanism. There was no lever. On the evening before launch, he received a program media credential through legitimate channels. He was the mission's primary private investor, and the launch ceremony included a stakeholder acknowledgement. He would be on stage. He had spent 48 hours deciding whether to use that position and concluded that he would, because he had run out of every other option. He stood backstage in the pre-dawn dark, in another dark suit, and he looked at the launch platform lit against the black sky, and he thought about Gerard Hale, who was currently under a level of financial and legal pressure that would require every resource the man possessed to survive, which was a different kind of settlement, but not the one that mattered right now. What mattered was in 3 hours. He walked out onto the stage when they called his name, into the light, into the applause of a crowd that had come to witness history. He stood at the podium and looked out at the platform and found her in approximately 4 seconds, because he had been finding Claire Whitmore in rooms for 16 years, and he knew exactly how she stood and how she held her shoulders and the specific way her chin lifted when she was nervous and refusing to show it. She was in the flight suit. Her hair was pulled back. She was standing with her crew in a line, and she was looking directly at him with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not the careful neutral, not the anger, not the careful love she'd spent years disguising. Something cleaner. Something that had been through the fire and come out the other side. He forgot the speech. He stood at the podium and looked at her and said, off script, into a microphone heard by several hundred people in a live broadcast feed, "I need everyone to stop. I need this launch to stop." The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of several hundred people processing what they had just heard. A man in a dark suit standing at a podium at a historic launch ceremony, speaking off script into a live microphone, telling the world to stop. 4 seconds of cameras swinging, of officials exchanging looks, of the crew line on the platform going very still. Then the sound came back all at once. Not applause. Something more like a pressure system shifting. The collective intake of a crowd that didn't know yet whether this was theater or crisis. Ethan stood at the podium and looked at Claire. She was looking back at him. Her chin had done the thing he knew. Lifted slightly, the tell she didn't know she had. Her hands were at her sides, not fisted, just still. She looked like a woman who had prepared herself for many things and was now encountering one she hadn't quite anticipated in the exact form it arrived. Director Lewis appeared at Ethan's left shoulder with the speed of a man who had spent a career managing unexpected variables. "Mr. Moretti," low voice, close to his ear. "This isn't the appropriate. I'm aware," Ethan said into the microphone, still looking at Claire. "I'm aware it's not appropriate. I'm also aware that in approximately 2 hours this crew boards a spacecraft that has no planned return, and there is something I should have said a long time ago that I did not say, and I am saying it now." Another wave of sound from the crowd. Cameras everywhere. He could see the broadcast monitors at the edges of the stage. This was going out live to several countries. He had known that when he stepped forward. He had decided it didn't matter. "Claire," he said. On the platform, she closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. "If I had told you the truth," he said, and his voice was steady in the way that things are steady when the person has gone past the point where steadiness requires effort. "Before any of this, if I had said what I actually felt instead of what I calculated you needed to hear, you would not be standing on that platform. That is my fault. Every piece of it, and I am sorry." The crowd had gone almost completely quiet again. That particular human instinct, when something real is happening in public, people stop making noise. "I'm asking you to come home," he said. Claire stood on this platform in her flight suit and looked at him across 200 feet of open air and the full weight of everything that had happened between them, and she did not move. Then she reached up and unclipped the small communications device at her collar and held it close to her mouth, and her voice came through the platform speakers, and everyone heard it. "If you had said that 6 months ago," she said, "I would have stayed." She clipped the device back. She turned and walked with her crew toward the boarding corridor. She did not look back. Ethan stood at the podium. He was aware of Director Lewis beside him, of Marcus somewhere in the crowd, of the cameras and the officials and the live feed going out to multiple countries. He was aware of all of it, and none of it mattered because the thing he had come here to prevent was still happening. Was happening right now, measured in footsteps. Claire's boots on the boarding walkway getting smaller with distance. He stepped away from the podium. "Mr. Moretti." "Lewis, sharper now. I need you to—" "I'm stepping back," Ethan said. "I'm done." He walked off the stage. Marcus found him backstage, leaning against a concrete wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance. Marcus had the wisdom not to say anything for a full minute. He stood beside him, and they both listened to the ceremony resume. A new voice at the podium, something about historic achievements, something about the courage of the crew. "She heard you," Marcus said finally. "Yes." "That's not nothing. It's also not enough." Marcus was quiet. Then, "What do you want to do?" Ethan looked at the launch platform through a gap in the staging. The boarding walkway was empty now. The crew was inside. "I want to watch it go," he said. "And then I want everything on Hale on my desk by tonight." They stood there, both of them, and watched the final countdown run. The rocket went up clean. The sound hit his chest before it reached his ears. That particular concussive physicality of a launch. Something you feel in your ribs and your back teeth before it registers as noise. He watched it until the light was a point, and then a trace, and then nothing against the brightening sky. He went home. The apartment was completely different. Vivian's things were gone. She'd had someone come while he was at the launch, efficient to the end. The throw blanket Claire had put on the couch was gone too, because it had been one of the things she'd packed. The leather couch looked the way it always had before she'd started trying to fix it, expensive and indifferent. He sat on it and looked at the space where the blanket had been. Then he picked up his phone and called his head of security and said, "I want everything accelerated on Hale, all of it. And I want the financial trail on the roster amendment fully documented and turned over to the FBI field office by end of day. We're burning the file? We're making it their problem through legitimate channels. I don't want any exposure on this. By the book, all of it." He set the phone down and sat in the empty apartment and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after the last possible option has been exhausted, that he had run out of moves. Claire was gone. Not angry gone, not I need space gone. Gone in the most absolute physics-enforced way available to a human being. Spacecraft gone. Past the reach of phone calls and legal maneuvers and men standing at podiums saying the things they should have said years ago. He sat with that for a long time. Then something shifted. Not dramatically. There was no moment of resolution, no clean decision. It was more like the feeling of a structure settling after a demolition. Things collapsing inward. He sat in the expensive, indifferent apartment and felt his empire, the thing he'd built and maintained and defended for 3 decades, feel for the first time like what it actually was. A monument to a set of priorities he was no longer certain he'd ever believed in. He stayed in the apartment for 3 days. His people left him alone because they understood, having worked for him long enough, that Ethan Moretti in stillness was more dangerous than Ethan. Moretti in motion, and they waited. On the 4th day, he came back. But something was different, and the people who had worked with him long enough noticed it immediately. Not in what he said. His instructions were the same, his precision unchanged. It was something in the eyes. A quality of attention that had previously been directed outward, at threats and operations and the endless chess of running a criminal organization that had turned somewhere else. Somewhere internal. Like a man taking inventory of a building he'd just decided to sell. He began with Hale. The FBI file landed on a federal prosecutor's desk 7 days after the launch. It was thorough enough that the prosecutor called Marcus Webb within the hour to ask, carefully, where the documentation had originated and whether the sourcing would survive judicial scrutiny. Marcus told him it would. He was right. Hale was indicted 11 weeks later on federal charges, including bribery of a government official, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 2 counts of wire fraud that carried sentences his attorneys were still trying to construct defenses against when Ethan had already moved on. But taking Hale down through legitimate channels was not the same as what Ethan did in parallel, in the spaces between the formal filings. That part was not for the courts. That part was efficient and final, and left Gerard Hale with nothing. No allies, no assets, no industry relationships that hadn't been quietly burned at the root. It was the most complete professional destruction Ethan had ever arranged, and when it was done, he felt nothing about it except a faint exhaustion, like finishing a task he'd always known was on the list. The harder work started after. He called a meeting with his 3 senior organizational directors and laid out a timeline. He was not asking for their input. He was informing them of a decision already made. He was going to dismantle the organization, not hand it off, not restructure it, dismantle it. Controlled and careful over a period of months, piece by piece. Every man who wanted out would get out, with resources to land somewhere. Every asset that could be legitimized would be. Everything that couldn't would be severed cleanly. The room was very quiet when he finished. His longest-serving director, a man named Sal, who had been with him for 22 years and had never once questioned an order, looked at him across the table for a long moment. "This is about the girl," Sal said, not accusatory, just noting. "It's about a lot of things," Ethan said. "Is she coming back?" "No." Sal looked at the table, then nodded, once. "All right," he said, as if that settled it. The dismantling took 8 months. Some of it was ugly. There were people who didn't want to let go of what they had, and those situations required handling in ways that he didn't enjoy and didn't rationalize. He was under no illusion that he was suddenly a different kind of man. He was the same kind of man making a different set of choices. And the distinction mattered to him, even if it wouldn't have meant much to anyone evaluating him from the outside. What he did with the money was where it got complicated. He liquidated first properties, holdings, the legitimate businesses that had been running clean for years. He moved the capital into a private foundation, which Marcus structured with the kind of legal meticulousness that would survive any level of scrutiny. The foundation had one stated purpose: private investment in deep space exploration research, with particular emphasis on propulsion and trajectory systems capable of supporting crew retrieval from long-duration missions. He funded the first 3 research teams himself, then 4 more. He heard the best people he could find, some of them from the same academic communities where Claire had worked, and he told them what he needed. He needed a return mechanism. He needed a way to bring a crew back from a trajectory that had been designed as permanent. The scientists told him it wasn't possible with existing technology. "Then build the technology," he said. They told him the timeline would be 15 years minimum, more likely 20. He told them to take the first installment and get to work and submit progress reports quarterly. He told them he would be there every quarter. He was. He moved out of the penthouse 14 months after the launch. He couldn't say exactly why. It was too large, and it had too much of Claire's attempts to fix it layered into its surfaces. He bought a house. Not in the city. A house by a lake, several hours north, where his nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the water at certain times of day was a color that had no name, and the quiet was complete enough that he could think. He kept the Research Foundation's quarterly reports in a folder on his desk. He kept the mission tracking data, Project Horizon's telemetry, whatever was publicly available, on a system in his study. He watched it the way you watch something that is going in a direction you can no longer affect, with a kind of stripped-down, constant attention that had no hope in it anymore, but also no end. He was 53 years old. He had dismantled everything he'd spent his life building. He was waiting. That was when the diagnosis came. He noticed the fatigue first, which he attributed to the years and the work and the sustained compression of everything he'd been carrying. I was not a man who went to doctors easily. He'd spent decades in a world where physical vulnerability was information you didn't share. He went when the fatigue became something else, something with a specific weight to it that his body recognized as different in kind from ordinary tiredness. The oncologist was a careful man who laid out the findings with the particular precision that Ethan had always respected in professionals. No softening, no theatrical pausing, just the data and the implication of the data. Stage 3. Slow-moving but established. Treatment options existed and had variable rates of effectiveness. He would want to begin as soon as possible. Ethan sat in the examination room and listened and asked 2 questions. One about the timeline without treatment, and one about the timeline with treatment and what that treatment would require in terms of time and functional capacity. The doctor answered both questions. Ethan thanked him. He drove home. He sat at the desk in his study with the mission tracking folder and the quarterly reports, and the lake visible through the window, and he thought about what he'd just been told. He thought about it with the same systematic attention he'd always brought to information he didn't like, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, understanding exactly what it meant. Then he opened a new folder on his desk. He put the oncologist's report in it. He wrote a note to Marcus about his will and certain foundation provisions he wanted formalized. He set that aside. Then he turned back to the quarterly reports. Treatment would consume months of his functional capacity. It would require energy and attention that were currently going toward the foundation and toward the quarterly meetings where he sat across from the best scientific minds he could fund and pushed them harder than they were used to being pushed. He had done the timeline calculation while sitting in the examination room. 15 to 20 years was already the optimistic projection. With treatment, he might see it. Without it, the numbers were different. He was not interested in the numbers being different. He did not tell his medical team he was declining treatment. He told them he needed time to consider his options, which bought him the silence he needed to make the decision properly. He spent 2 weeks at the lake house, alone, with the quarterly reports and the tracking data and the particular quiet of the water in the mornings. He was sitting at his desk on the 13th day when the tracking data showed something he hadn't expected. He'd been monitoring the telemetry through a back channel that one of his funded researchers had set up. Not official, not public, but live data piped from a military tracking station via a source the researcher had cultivated for years. The data showed Project Horizon's trajectory, updated every 6 hours. It had been consistent for months, moving along the expected course toward the outer system. On the 13th day, it showed something different. The trajectory had bent, not mechanically, not a course correction, not a propulsion event. The signature was wrong for any of those. What the data showed was a gravitational interaction of a magnitude that the planned route didn't include, something the mission hadn't anticipated, or had anticipated and not published, or had encountered unexpectedly at the edge of the planned corridor. He called his lead researcher at 4 a.m. The man picked up on the second ring because he had also been awake and looking at the same data. "I see it," the researcher said immediately, before Ethan could speak. His voice had the particular quality of someone trying to be calm while their mind was running much faster than their words. "I've been on the phone with 2 colleagues for the last hour." "What is it?" Ethan said. "We think it's a gravitational anomaly, a strong one, uncharted. It's not in any of the existing maps at that depth of the corridor." A pause. The sound of papers. The interaction at that magnitude, at the crew's current velocity, the relativistic effects could be significant. What does significant mean? Time dilation, the researcher said quietly. If the crew passed through the core of that anomaly, and the trajectory data suggests they did, the time differential between their frame and ours could be substantial. We're still running the models. But Ethan. A pause. If the numbers hold, tell me. The crew may have experienced a matter of weeks, months at most. Another pause. While several years have passed out here, potentially more. Ethan sat very still. "What does that mean for return?" he said. "It means—" The researcher stopped. He seemed to be choosing words very carefully. "It means the physics we've been working with for the return system just changed. If they pass through that anomaly, and if the time differential is what we think it is, then a retrieval vehicle entering a comparable anomaly under controlled conditions might be able to—" He stopped again. "I need more time to run the models." "Run them," Ethan said. "Tonight, everyone, all resources. I want a preliminary analysis by morning." He set the phone down. He sat in his study with the lake dark outside the window and the tracking data on the screen showing a trajectory that had bent in a direction that the physics of the previous 20 years of planning had never included. And he felt something he hadn't felt since the morning after the launch. Not hope, exactly. He was too old and too deliberate to call it that. But something had moved. The preliminary analysis arrived at 7:15 the next morning in a document that was 60 pages long and flagged in 17 places for uncertainty. He read all of it. He called the lead researcher back and went through the flagged sections one by one, asking the same question in different forms until he understood exactly where the certainty ended and the theoretical began. Then he called Marcus. "I need the Foundation's investment capacity restructured," he said. "Everything that's currently allocated to long-term propulsion research gets reoriented. I'll send you a technical summary. The short version is that there's a new target, a specific type of gravitational anomaly interaction, controlled entry, retrieval-focused. I need the best people in this field working on it immediately." "How much are we talking?" Marcus said. Ethan looked at the 60-page analysis. "All of it," he said, "whatever it takes." He hung up. He went to the window and looked at the lake. The morning light on the water was doing the thing it did sometimes, catching at an angle that turned the surface into something that looked almost solid. He stood there for a while, just looking. Then he went back to his desk and opened the oncologist's report. He read it again, carefully. All of it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the oncologist's office and told the receptionist that he wanted to schedule a follow-up, not for treatment, for a complete picture of the timeline, without treatment, with maximum functional maintenance. He wanted to understand exactly what he had and how to use it. Because the models said the return system, if it worked, if the physics held, if the funding and the research and the 20-year gamble paid out, would be operational in approximately 18 to 20 years. He was 53 years old with a slow-moving cancer he was choosing not to treat. The math was not good, but the math had never been the point. He was going to be there when that mission came home, even if being there required everything he had left to give, because Claire Whitmore had stood on a platform in a flight suit and told him that if he'd spoken sooner she would have stayed, and that was a sentence he was going to spend the rest of his life, however much of it remained, making mean something. He went back to the window. The lake held the light. He stayed there until the morning moved past him and the day began, and then he sat down and started working. The 18 years passed the way hard years do, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular grinding consistency of time measured in work rather than in living. Ethan kept the quarterly meetings. Every 90 days, without exception, he drove the 3 hours from the lake house to the Foundation's primary research facility outside Albany and sat in a conference room with his lead team and went through the progress reports line by line. He asked the same questions he'd always asked, not to demonstrate authority, but because he'd learned enough in 18 years to know when an answer was evasive and when it was honest. The scientists had stopped being surprised by him after the first 2 years. They'd started somewhere around year 5 to actually argue with him in the meetings, which he took as a sign that things were working. The cancer moved slowly. That was the word the oncologist had used in the first follow-up after Ethan's decision, slowly. It would move slowly, and if he maintained certain functional protocols, specific monitoring, specific interventions that stopped short of the aggressive treatment he'd declined, it might continue to move slowly for a long time. Long was not defined. The oncologist was too precise a man to define long without data. Ethan took the protocols. He ran the monitoring. He managed the cancer the way he managed everything, with attention and without drama, and with the understanding that it was a variable he could partially influence but not control, and that spending energy on variables he couldn't control was a form of waste he'd never been able to afford. He did not tell most people. Marcus knew. His lead researcher, a man named Dr. Paul Garrett, who had become over 18 years the closest thing to a friend that Ethan Moretti allowed himself, knew because he was perceptive and had simply asked one day, directly, and Ethan had told him because lying to a man who was trying to build you a return vehicle seemed counterproductive. Garrett had looked at him across the conference table and said, "How long?" "Long enough," Ethan said, "if the work holds." Garrett had nodded and gone back to the physics. The breakthrough, when it came, did not arrive as a single moment. That was the thing Ethan had not understood about science before he started funding it. The breakthroughs in films happened in a flash, a single equation on a board, a eureka that split the timeline into before and after. Real breakthroughs were more like geological processes. A finding confirmed here, a model revised there, a test result that didn't fit the current framework and therefore required the current framework to be reconstructed from the foundation. But in the spring of the 18th year, 3 things aligned. The first was a controlled gravitational mapping project that Garrett's team had been running for 4 years, cataloging the edge of the anomaly zone that Project Horizon's telemetry had identified. The maps confirmed something the theoretical models had predicted but never been able to verify. There was a secondary corridor, a gravitational fold adjacent to the main anomaly, that created a bidirectional possibility, something you could enter from either side, if you knew exactly where to enter and at exactly what velocity and trajectory. The second was a propulsion development that a partnered team in Germany had achieved after 11 years of iterative work, an engine capable of the precise sustained thrust required to hit that exact entry window without deviation. The tolerances were brutal. The margin of error was measured in meters per second across a distance of millions of miles. But the engine existed, and it worked. The third was the telemetry. Garrett called him at 5:40 in the morning on a Thursday, and Ethan picked up on the first ring because he had been asleep, but he was also 71 years old and did not sleep deeply anymore. "We have a signal," Garrett said. Ethan sat up. "Project Horizon." "Yes." A pause. "They're coming back through the anomaly. The trajectory is already resolving. If the time differential calculations held..." Another pause, and in it Ethan could hear Garrett working to keep his voice at the register of a scientist, and not the register of a man who has just watched 20 years of work arrive at its intended destination. She could be home in 72 hours. He was out of bed and dressed before the call ended. He drove the 3 hours to Albany in 2.5, which was not something a 71-year-old man with a slow-moving cancer should do, and which he did anyway, because there was no version of this moment in which he was not in that building when the signal resolved. Garrett met him in the parking lot, which meant Garrett had been watching for him, which was the kind of thing that happened after 18 years of working alongside someone. The facility's main monitoring room had 12 people in it when Ethan walked through the door, and the room smelled like coffee and like the particular electric tension of people who have been awake for a long time watching something they cannot afford to look away from. He found a chair at the back. He sat in it. He looked at the tracking screens. The signal was there, clean and consistent, coming in from the trajectory corridor they'd mapped over 4 years. The approach vector was matching the model with a precision that made Garrett's lead tracking analyst turn from her screen and say, in a voice that had no professional calm left in it at all, "It's exact. The vector is exact. They came through exactly where the model said." No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then Garrett turned and looked at Ethan across the room. Ethan said nothing. He looked at the screen. He looked at the signal trace, the clean, steady line of it, coming in from the deep of the outer system. He put his hands flat on his thighs and sat very still. 72 hours. The mission recovery protocol, the framework they'd spent years building in coordination with the Federal Space Authority, negotiated through 6 rounds of bureaucratic resistance that had cost Ethan money and Marcus significant patience, activated within hours of the signal confirmation. The formal announcement was delayed 18 hours while the tracking data was independently verified, which Ethan understood and accepted because he had learned over 2 decades how these institutions moved and what they required to move properly. He drove back to the lake house on the first night. He didn't know why exactly. He just knew he needed to be there rather than in the facility, that being in the facility for the next 72 hours watching numbers resolve would do something to his chest that he couldn't afford. He needed to be in the place that had held him for 18 years, the kitchen he knew, the desk with the folder on it, the window with the lake outside. He walked through the house slowly when he arrived. He was tired, the kind of tired that was partly the drive and partly the cancer doing its slow work, and partly the weight of what was approximately 60 hours away. He went to his study. The tracking folder was there. 18 years of quarterly reports, each one flagged and noted in his handwriting. The progress curves, the setbacks, and there had been significant ones. 2 years in the middle of the work where Garrett had come to the quarterly meeting looking like a man who had been awake for most of the preceding month, and told Ethan that the bidirectional corridor model had a fundamental error that required rebuilding from a different theoretical base. Ethan had sat with that for the length of the meeting and then said, "Rebuild it," and they had. He opened the folder. He looked at the first entry. A handwritten note from the morning after the launch, a list of research targets that he'd drafted sitting at his desk in the apartment before he'd moved out. The handwriting was his from 18 years ago, slightly different, steadier, maybe. He'd been a different kind of tense then, the sharp tension of a man who has just lost something and is converting the loss into motion. Now the tension was different, quieter, the tension of arrival. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it and looked at the lake in the dark. The water was black and still. He thought about Claire, not in the way he'd been thinking about her for 18 years, the maintenance mode of it, keeping what he knew of her in a stable place inside him while he worked. He thought about her as a specific person he was going to see in 60 hours. She would be 24 years old. He was 71. He had known this was coming. He had lived with the arithmetic of it for 18 years. The time dilation, the relativistic math, the model that said she would emerge from that anomaly months older than she'd been when she went in, while decades had moved out here. He had funded the work knowing exactly what it meant. He had made peace with it in the way you make peace with mathematics, not by changing the numbers, but by accepting that the numbers are what they are and deciding what to do about them anyway. What he was going to do was not be there when she came out. He had decided this sitting at his desk in the lake house on a winter morning 6 years ago, when the models had first suggested the return was actually viable. So not theoretical, not aspirational, but physically achievable in a time frame he might survive to see. He had sat with the realization that he was going to be there for it and worked out, carefully, what being there meant. It did not mean standing at the landing site in his condition, aging and ill, and presenting himself to a 24-year-old woman who had last seen him at a podium asking the world to stop. It did not mean making the first moments of her return about managing his presence. It meant having done the work, having built the mechanism that brought her home, and then stepping back because she had not asked for his sacrifice and did not owe him anything for it, and because the kind of love he'd spent 18 years restructuring his entire life around was not the kind that required an audience. He was going to leave her a letter. He had written it 11 times over the years. The 12th draft was in his desk drawer, the one he'd written 3 years ago and not touched since, because he'd read it and it finally said what it needed to say without saying too much. He took it out now and read it again in the kitchen light. It was 4 pages. He read all of it. Then he put it back in the drawer and went to bed. He slept better than he had in years. That was the strange thing. He lay in the dark with the lake outside the window and the quiet that he'd spent 18 years inside and felt something release in his chest. Not pain, not the cancer, but something older and tighter that he hadn't realized he was still holding. He slept. He was at the recovery landing site, a federal facility in the Nevada desert, the designated recovery zone that had been locked into the return mission protocol for a decade, 36 hours before the projected landing window. I was there as a Foundation stakeholder, credentialed and expected. Garrett was with him. Marcus was there. There were government officials and mission scientists and a medical team and a press pool kept at a significant distance behind barriers. The facility was organized chaos with a professional surface over it. People with tablets moving quickly in all directions. The medical preparation team setting up the mobile units for crew assessment, standard protocol for long-duration missions, checking for physical and psychological effects of extended space travel. Ethan walked through it and noted details and said little. Garrett stayed close. At one point he said quietly, "You're not going to go to her, are you?" "No," Ethan said. Garrett didn't push it. He understood, probably better than anyone except Marcus, what Ethan had decided and why. The landing came in 18 minutes ahead of the projected window, which made the tracking analysts briefly frantic before the data confirmed it was the correct vehicle and the entry angle was within parameters. The craft hit the atmosphere and the re-entry plasma bloom was visible from the observation deck, a streak of orange-white against the desert sky that moved faster than it seemed like it should, and then resolved into a vehicle with chutes deploying, dropping toward the marked zone in the sand. Ethan watched it from the observation deck. His chest was doing something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite the cancer. It was something else, something purely mechanical that the 18 years hadn't prepared him for, which was the physical reality of watching a vehicle come back from a trajectory that everyone had agreed was permanent. It landed. The medical teams moved. The barriers held the press back. The official debrief vehicles rolled toward the craft. Ethan stood on the observation deck and watched. He watched the hatch open. He watched the medical team approach. He was too far to see faces clearly, and that was deliberate. He'd positioned himself at a distance that gave him sight of the event without being visible to people at the craft. An old skill, positioning. He'd used it for different purposes for 30 years. He saw her, even at distance, across the desert floor, with the heat shimmering and the medical team surrounding the crew. He saw her, because he had been finding Claire Whitmore in rooms for 16 years before she left, and he had been locating her in the data and the telemetry for 18 years after, and his body knew her. She walked out of the craft under her own power. That was the first thing. She walked. The medical team moved to assist, and she said something. He couldn't hear it, too far, and they adjusted their approach, giving her space. She stood on the desert floor and looked at the sky for a moment, which was the thing she always did when she first came out somewhere. Stood and looked at whatever was overhead, taking her bearings. Then she looked around the facility. He stepped back from the railing, not hiding, just removing himself from the sightline. He watched her talking to the official debrief team, the preliminary questions, crew status, medical assessment. She was alert. She was standing straight. She was 24 years old, and she had the posture of someone who had been through something significant and was processing it in real time with the particular capability she'd always had. He looked at her for 60 seconds. Then he turned and walked back through the facility to the liaison office where his materials were being held, and he collected the letter and gave it to Marcus with specific instructions. Not today, not in the debrief phase, not until she had been medically cleared and given 24 hours to stabilize. Then a courier, official-looking, delivered with a cover note identifying it as correspondence from the Project Horizon Private Foundation, which was true technically in every way that mattered. "You're sure?" Marcus said. "Yes." Marcus looked at him for a moment. The look of a man who has known another man for 40 years and understands when arguing is pointless. "All right," he said. Ethan thanked him. He left the facility before the press briefing. He got into the car with his driver. He didn't drive himself anymore, hadn't for 2 years, which was a concession to the cancer's effect on his reaction time that he'd made without pleasure, and he watched the Nevada desert move past the window as they drove toward the airport. He thought about the letter. 4 pages. He'd written 11 versions and kept the 12th. It said what had needed saying, the real account of every decision he'd made, starting from the night her parents died and continuing through the fake engagement and the calculated cruelty and the launch day and the 18 years. All of it. The reasoning and the failures of reasoning. The love that he'd spent 30 years refusing to name correctly. He had not asked her to do anything with the letter. He had not ended it with a request or a hope or an instruction. He had ended it with 3 sentences. "I spent 20 years building a way to bring you home because it was the only thing I could do that was worth doing. The house at the lake has been kept exactly as you would have wanted it. You were loved from the beginning." He sat in the car and looked at the desert. He was 71 years old. The cancer was moving more than it had. He had 6 weeks, the oncologist had said at the last appointment, possibly 8 with good management. He had arranged everything with Marcus, the foundation, the endowment, the research continuation, the lake house. The lake house was in her name. Had been for 3 years. He had put it in her name the same winter he'd written the 12th draft of the letter, on a quiet afternoon when the lake was frozen over and the light was doing the silver thing it did in February. And he'd sat with Marcus and signed the papers and felt, afterward, a kind of settled satisfaction that he hadn't expected. He watched the desert give way to the edge of a small town, gas stations and a water tower, and the ordinary texture of a place that had no idea that 60 miles behind it, a spacecraft had just returned from somewhere that physics said it shouldn't be able to come back from. His phone buzzed. Garrett. He picked up. "She asked," Garrett said. His voice was careful. "First thing, after the medical clear, she asked who funded the return mission." Ethan held the phone and said nothing. "They told her it was the Project Horizon Private Foundation," Garrett continued. "She asked who ran the foundation." A pause. "She already knew. I could tell from how she asked. She knew, and she was checking." "What did she do?" Ethan said. "She didn't say anything for a while," Garrett said. "Then she asked where you were." The car moved. The desert continued. Ethan held the phone and looked at the passing landscape, the hard, flat distances, the sky above it that was the particular color of late afternoon in the southwest, that specific dry blue with no moisture in it. "What did they tell her?" he said. "That you'd left the facility before the press briefing." Garrett paused. "Ethan, she looked like—" He stopped. "I don't have the right words for what she looked like." "Did she say anything else?" "She said she needed a vehicle," Garrett said quietly. "She said she needed to know where you lived." The phone was warm against his ear. He could hear his own breathing, steady, slower than it used to be. The cancer had changed the rhythm of it without him noticing until sometime in the last year. He thought about the lake house, the letter, the 4 pages that said everything that should have been said decades ago, the house that had been in her name for 3 years without her knowing. He thought about a 24-year-old woman standing in a Nevada desert asking where he lived with an expression that Garrett, who was not given to imprecision, had run out of words to describe. "Tell her," Ethan said. Garrett gave her the address without hesitation, which meant Ethan had told him to, which meant Ethan had known she would ask, which meant he had been prepared for this and had chosen to leave anyway. And Claire sat with all of that in the back of the government vehicle, moving north through the Nevada dark, and felt the layers of it settle into her one at a time like sediment. She had been on the ground for 11 hours. The medical team had cleared her after 4 hours of assessment, physically intact, vitals stable, no significant radiation exposure, minor muscle atrophy from the extended mission timeline that would resolve with standard rehabilitation. They had been thorough and professional, and she had answered every question with the part of her brain that was still running on mission protocols while the rest of her brain was doing something else entirely. She had been in space for what felt like 4 months. She had come back to find that 18 years had passed on Earth. The crew had been briefed on the possibility before launch, the theoretical framework for time dilation under extreme gravitational conditions had been part of their mission preparation, listed under low-probability scenarios in a document that the mission psychologist had discussed with them twice. Claire had understood it then the way you understand a mathematical abstraction that hasn't yet acquired weight. She understood it now the way you understand a thing that has happened to your body. Not abstractly at all. Noah Carter had come through it with the same fundamental steadiness he brought to everything. He was the one who had held the crew together during the gravitational passage, when the instruments had gone haywire, and the timeline had dissolved into something that couldn't be measured by anything they had on board. He'd looked at Claire in the middle of it, when the hull was groaning and the telemetry was running numbers that didn't fit any of their training, and said, "We're going to be all right." Not as reassurance, as a statement of intent. She had believed him. She still believed him. He was the best person she had ever worked with, and she had told him so in the debrief, clearly and completely, because she'd learned in the last 4 months that the things worth saying should be said. After the debrief, she had stood outside the medical facility in the Nevada evening with the desert air hitting her face, and she had looked up at the sky, which was what she always did, and she had thought about 18 years. Her doctorate was 36 years old. The research she'd been building on her parents' work, the gravitational anomaly models, the edge case physics, was now apparently the foundation of the entire retrieval science that had brought her home. Her work. Extended and developed and built upon by researchers she had never met, funded by a private foundation that had invested everything it had into solving a problem that, she now understood, had been very specifically her problem. She had asked who ran the foundation. She had already known. She was in the vehicle for 6 hours. She slept for 2 of them, which surprised her. She hadn't expected her body to allow sleep, running on what it was running on, but the mission had conditioned her to take rest when it was available, regardless of what her mind was doing. She woke up somewhere in the Utah dark and looked out the window at the shapes of mountains against the sky and thought about Ethan at 71. She had seen him on the observation deck, briefly. He'd stepped back, she'd registered movement and looked, and then he was gone, too far and too fast to be certain. But she'd known. The way she'd always known. The same instinct that had been filing things away about Ethan Moretti since she was 11 years old. She'd known he was there, and she'd known he had stepped back deliberately, and she'd known what that meant. It meant he didn't think he should be the one to come to her. 18 years, and he still didn't think he'd earned the right to be the one who moved first. She watched the mountains. The vehicle reached the lake house at 4:17 in the morning. The driver, a young federal agent who had said almost nothing for 6 hours, which she appreciated, told her they'd been instructed to provide her transportation and lodging at a facility in the area, that she didn't need to do this tonight, that the medical team had recommended rest before any— "Thank you," she said, and got out. The house was dark. One light on. The study, she could see it from the driveway, the warm rectangle of it against the dark exterior. She stood in the driveway for a moment. The air up here was different from Nevada, cooler, with actual moisture in it, and the smell of water from the lake somewhere beyond the house. She stood in the driveway and looked at the lit window and took one breath. Then she walked to the door and knocked. Silence. Long enough that she began to wonder if she'd miscalculated, if he'd told Garrett to give her the address and then left, if this was another managed distance, another calculated step back for her supposed benefit. The door opened. Ethan Moretti at 71 was a different architecture than the man she remembered. His hair was fully white, had been for years from the look of it. He was thinner than he'd been. Not frail, not yet, but the particular thinness of someone who has been spending more energy than they've been taking in for a while. His face had the deep lines of a man who had spent decades in concentration, and his eyes, which had always been the most unguarded thing about him in the moments when he forgot to guard them, were the same. He looked at her. She had thought, on the drive, about what she would say first. She had rehearsed it in several configurations. Standing in front of him at 4 in the morning, with the lake air between them, she said none of those things. "You left," she said. "Yes." "You built a machine to bring me home, and then you left before I could see you." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you'd want—" "Don't," she said. Her voice was steady, and it was also not entirely steady, and she didn't try to fix that. "Don't tell me what you thought I'd want. You have been deciding what I want for 34 years, and I am done with that particular arrangement." He opened the door wider. She walked in. The house was— She stopped in the entryway and looked around. The house was the kind of place she would have chosen if she'd been choosing. Not decorated, not designed, inhabited. There were books on the side table in the entryway with bookmarks in them, and a jacket on the hook by the door, and a pair of boots that had been worn in the actual weather. The walls had photographs, and she looked at the nearest one and felt the ground shift slightly under her, because the photograph was one she recognized. A snapshot from her undergraduate thesis defense, one of the ones she'd thought was lost when she left. She looked at the photographs. All of them, the ones she could see from the entryway. She was in most of them, different ages, different moments. Some she remembered being taken, and some she had no memory of. Her at 12, laughing at something out of frame. Her at 19, bent over a desk in what was clearly one of the university labs. Her parents' wedding photograph, which she had not seen since she was 8 years old and which she had believed was gone. "You kept them," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. I was standing in the hallway with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her face, and he looked like a man who was holding himself at a specific structural precision, because if he relaxed it, something would give way that he couldn't afford to have give way. She recognized the posture. She had watched him use it for 34 years. "The letter," she said. "You got it." "I read it on the drive." She had read it 3 times. The 4th time she'd had to stop, because the vehicle's interior was not the right place to do what reading it a 4th time would have required. "I have questions." "I know." "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been awake all night." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite pain. He moved to the main room and sat in a chair, and she sat on the couch across from him, and they looked at each other in the lamplight with the lake dark outside the windows, and 18 years between them that were going to have to be accounted for. "The cancer," she said. "How long?" He was quiet for a moment. "They said 6 to 8 weeks at the last appointment. That was 3 weeks ago." She received that. She sat with it the way she'd trained herself to sit with information that changed the shape of everything. Not fleeing it, not yet, just letting it be exactly the size it was. "You chose not to treat it," she said. "Yes." "Because you needed the functional capacity for the foundation." "Yes." "That was your decision to make," she said. "I understand that. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm angry about a lot of things, Ethan. That's not one of them." He looked at her carefully. "What are you angry about?" She looked at the photographs on the wall. Her parents' wedding photograph. She looked at it for a moment. "The journals," she said. "The night Vivian damaged them. You said they could be restored." "I know." "You let her do that. Not the damage. I understand you didn't know about the damage. But you let her into that apartment, into that life. And you let her treat me like a variable to be managed, and you didn't explain yourself. You chose the cruelty, and you never told me why." She looked back at him. "The letter says why. It says you thought if I hated you, I'd leave. That you thought leaving was the best thing for me." She paused. "What made you think you got to decide that?" "Nothing," he said. "I didn't have the right to decide it. I decided it anyway." "Yes, you did." She looked at her hands. "I've been thinking, on the drive, about the thing I said at the launch. I said, if you had told me the truth before that day, I wouldn't have boarded the spacecraft." "I know. I've been wondering if that was true." She looked up. "I think it was true when I said it. I think I believed it completely. But I've had 4 months, subjective time, which is what I have to work with, to think about my parents' research and what the mission actually was, and whether I would have been able to turn away from it even if everything had been different." She paused. "I don't know the answer. I think that's important to say. I don't know if I would have stayed." He was looking at her with an expression she was cataloging in real time because she had never seen it before on him. A complete absence of management. No calculation about what she needed or what was best or what the correct response was. He was just looking at her, receiving what she was saying, without the machinery. "The mission mattered," he said. "Yes." "Your parents' work mattered." "Yes." "And you came back," he said. "You built a way to bring me back. I needed you to be able to come back." He said it simply, without arrangement. "Whether you chose to or not was yours. I just needed there to be a choice available." She sat with that. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to change. The particular shift of a sky moving from deep night toward the suggestion of morning, not yet light, but no longer fully dark. The lake would be visible soon. "Tell me about the 18 years," she said. "Not the foundation, the life. What you did." He looked slightly surprised by the question, which meant he hadn't expected her to want that part. I dismantled the organization, he said. 8 months, piece by piece. Why? Because it was what I'd built instead of what I actually wanted, and I couldn't maintain interest in it anymore. What did you do after? I came here, he said. I ran the foundation. I had quarterly meetings with researchers who became... He paused. Garrett has been here 18 years. We have dinner once a month. He argues with me about the models. I read some of the research, she said. On the drive, on my phone, the gravitational corridor mapping. The team built it directly on my dissertation work. Yes. My research brought me home, she said. And then, because she was exhausted and had been through a gravitational anomaly and 4 months in deep space and 6 hours in a vehicle, and was now sitting across from a dying man at 4:30 in the morning. I find that almost funny. Something changed in his face. Not quite a smile, something more inward than that. Your mother would have found it funny, he said. She had that specific appreciation for things that were simultaneously terrible and elegant. Claire looked at her parents' wedding photograph on the wall. You knew them, she said. Not accusatory. She had known he'd known them. He'd taken her in after their deaths, had known how to reach her in the hospital, had clearly been something to them before she was old enough to understand what. From the letter, you said you funded their research before the accident. How long before? 4 years, he said. I met your father through a mutual contact. He was trying to finance a research project that no institution would touch because the theoretical framework was too speculative. I had money and I found the idea worth pursuing. We became, he paused. Friends is perhaps a strong word for what two men like your father and I could be to each other. But we respected each other. I attended 2 conferences where he presented. I was at the dinner where he met your mother. You were there, she said quietly. Yes. When they died. She had never asked this directly. She had been 8 years old when it happened and had been placed into Ethan's care so quickly that she had never had the gap of time in which to ask the basic questions. The accident, you told me it was a car accident. A long pause. It wasn't, she said. He looked at her steadily. No. The room was very still. Tell me, she said. He told her. It took a long time. He didn't spare himself in the telling. That was the thing she registered as he talked, that there was no version of events in which he came out clean, and he wasn't constructing one. Her parents had been working on research that had implications beyond astrophysics. The gravitational anomaly models, taken to their full extension, had applications in energy physics that certain industrial interests had found threatening. There had been pressure, first financial, then more direct. Ethan had known about the pressure. He had thought he'd addressed it. He had been wrong about the completeness of his address, and 2 people he respected had died on a road in Pennsylvania on a winter night because he had miscalculated the reach of people he thought he'd neutralized. He had spent 3 months after their deaths locating and dismantling every person and structure involved. That part he did not elaborate on. He said it plainly, and she accepted it plainly. You took me in because you felt responsible, she said. I took you in because I felt responsible and because your father had asked me to, he said. A year before he died, he asked me, not dramatically, not as a premonition, just as a man who worked in a world with risks and wanted to be practical about them. He asked me that if anything happened to them, he wanted someone to look after you who would take it seriously. He paused. He said you were extraordinary. He said you were the thing he was most certain of in his life. She looked at the photograph. He knew you, she said. He trusted you with me. Yes. And then I grew up in your house and fell in love with you, she said, which he presumably did not plan for. The directness of it landed in the room with a weight she'd intended. She watched his face receive it. No, Ethan said. I don't think he planned for that. When did you know, she said, that what you felt was that, not guardianship, not responsibility? He was quiet for a long moment. Longer ago than I'm comfortable saying. Say it anyway. He looked at her. You were 21. You came home from a conference, and you'd presented your first major paper, and it had been received better than anyone expected, and you walked into the apartment still in your conference clothes with the lanyard still around your neck, and you were incandescent with it. That specific quality you have when something you've worked for lands right. He paused. I understood that night what I'd been refusing to name. 3 years, she said. You knew for 3 years, and then you introduced me to Vivian. Yes. And the cruelty was on purpose. All of it. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the lake was becoming visible, the gray pre-dawn version of it, flat and still, with the tree line emerging on the far shore. She stood there and looked at it. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to just hear it without managing your response to it." "All right." She turned. "I spent 4 months in space thinking I would never see you again," she said. "That was the design of the mission. I had made my peace with it the way you make peace with things that are structural and unchangeable, completely, in the sense that I stopped fighting it, but not in the sense that it stopped hurting. And then we went through the anomaly and the physics changed, and we started picking up signals, and Noah figured out before anyone told us officially that something was happening that wasn't in the mission plan." She paused. "And the first thing I thought when I understood we were coming back was that I didn't know if you'd still be alive." He was very still. "That was my first thought," she said. "Not the mission data, not the implications for physics, you." She looked at him. "So I need you to understand that I am not here because I have processed everything neatly and arrived at a position. I am here because you are dying, and I have approximately 3 weeks, and I am not going to spend them being managed." "No," he said, "you're not." "I'm also not going to pretend that everything you did was acceptable," she said. "It wasn't. The cruelty was real. The journals were real. The 3 years of choosing not to tell me were real. Those are true things, and they're going to stay true things." "Yes." "And I'm also not going to pretend that I don't understand why," she said. "Because I have had 4 months to think about it, and I understand the architecture of it, even the parts that were wrong. I understand what you were afraid of, and I understand that the fear was real, even when the decisions it produced were damaging." She paused. "Understanding something isn't the same as forgiving it." "I know that." "But I'm here," she said. He looked at her. The lamplight made the room warm against the gray outside the window. "You're here," he said. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair. Not on the couch, not at the managed distance of a conversation, but close, where she could see his face properly in the available light. He looked up at her, and the thing that had always been in his eyes when he forgot to lock it away was entirely unlocked now, and she looked at it without looking away. "Tell me about the lake," she said. "In the mornings. What it looks like." He looked slightly disoriented by the shift. "Why?" "Because I want to know what your life here was," she said. "I want to know what you did in the 18 years. Not the foundation. You. What you ate for breakfast, and whether you kept a garden, and what you read when the research reports were done." She paused. "I want to know you. I have wanted to know you for 34 years, and I have been getting fragments, and I am done with fragments." He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked about the lake in the mornings, the February light on the frozen surface, the specific silver of it. He talked about the garden, which he had attempted in the second year and failed at entirely, and attempted again in the fourth year with better results, and which now had a section along the south wall where he'd planted the same flowers that Claire's mother had kept in the yard of the house Claire had grown up in before she was 8, because he'd found a photograph and matched the species, and it had seemed important. He talked about cooking, which he'd learned in the lake house because he'd had no one else to cook, and he'd been unwilling to eat badly for 18 years. He talked about the books. He read more now than he ever had, and he had specific opinions about specific books that were not the opinions of a man performing literacy, but the opinions of a man who had been alone with books for a long time and had developed real relationships with them. He talked. She listened. Outside the window, the lake went from gray to silver to the first pale blue of morning, and by the time the sun was fully up, they had been talking for 2 hours, and the house had stopped feeling like someone else's and started feeling like a place that was going to have to accommodate her. She made coffee. She found the kitchen without being shown where things were. The layout was straightforward, and she'd always had a functional instinct for spaces. She found the good cups without searching. She brought 2 and handed him one and sat back on the arm of his chair and looked at the lake through the window, which was now the full morning color of it. "I need to call Noah," she said. "He'll want to know I'm all right." "I know who Carter is," Ethan said. There was something in his voice that was not quite the old jealousy of a man who has no claim. It was more rueful than that, more self-aware. "He's a good man." "He's my best friend," she said. "He has been for 18 years subjectively and apparently 36 years objectively. I need to account for that math with him." She looked at her coffee. "There's a lot of math to account for." "Yes." "My dissertation is 36 years old," she said. "I'm 24. "Yes." The research I was building on my parents' work has been extended for 18 years by some of the best people in the field, he said, funded completely. Your foundational models are the basis of the retrieval science. Your name is on the primary citation of every major paper in the field for the last decade. She absorbed that. You made sure of that. Garrett made sure of that. I funded the environment that made it possible. A pause. The distinction matters to me. She looked at him. Why? Because I didn't want you to come home to something I'd built for you, he said. I wanted you to come home to something you'd built that I'd helped sustain. There's a difference. She thought about that for a long moment. The house, she said. Garrett told me in the car. He called while I was in the vehicle. He said the house is in my name. Yes. Since when? 3 years ago. Why? He looked at the lake. Because I wanted you to have somewhere to come back to that was yours. Not mine, not a place I was offering you. Yours, legally, completely, with no negotiation required. He paused. And because I was not entirely certain I would be alive when you landed, and I wanted it to be in order. She looked at the lake, too. The water was doing the morning thing he'd described. The light coming from the east and finding the surface at the angle that turned it into something that looked almost solid. She understood now what he'd meant. She sat with her coffee and looked at it and felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off the spacecraft, something that was not urgency or grief or calculation, something quieter. I'm going to stay, she said. He turned to look at her. Not because you're dying, she said. Not as management or as debt settlement. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. She looked at him directly. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said. I understand the difference. Good. She got up. She carried her coffee to the window and looked at the lake. The garden, she said. You said the south wall. I want to see it. Now? It's morning, she said. Show me the garden. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him set down his cup and stand, slower than he once had, the effort of it briefly audible. She didn't turn around. She gave him the dignity of the movement without an audience. Then he was beside her at the window. The roses are past, he said. This time of year it's mostly... Show me, she said. They went out through the kitchen door into the morning air. The garden was along the south wall exactly as he'd said, and it was larger than she'd pictured. Not formal, not designed, but tended with the particular attention of someone who had been doing it long enough to understand what each plant needed. She walked along it slowly. He walked beside her. She stopped at the section he'd planted from the photograph. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at the flowers, her mother's flowers, reconstructed from a photograph by a man who had no particular skill for gardening and had learned enough to make them grow. You learned to garden, she said. Badly, he said. Then adequately. My mother's flowers. Yes. She crouched down and looked at them closely. The leaves had the slight asymmetry of things grown from seed rather than transplanted, which meant he'd grown them from seed, which meant he'd tracked down the seeds and figured out the germination conditions and done it year after year for long enough that the plants were established and healthy. She stood up. How many years, she said. 16, he said. I killed them twice. The third attempt held. She turned and looked at him in the morning light, which was less forgiving than the lamplight had been. It showed everything the lamp had softened. The lines, the thinness, the specific quality of a person who is using what they have carefully because they know it's finite, but also the steadiness, the eyes, which were the same. I'm angry, she said. I want you to know I'm still angry, not in a way that's going anywhere immediately, just as a fact. I know, he said. And I love you, she said. I have loved you since I was old enough to understand what that meant, and I have been angry about it for a long time, which is also not going anywhere. He looked at her, the morning light on his face. I know that too. Good, she said. Then we're clear. She looked at the garden. We should have breakfast, she said, and then I need to call Noah, and then... She paused. You said you have a medical appointment. When? Thursday. I'm coming with you. Claire, I'm coming with you, she said again, simply, without room. You do not get to manage this alone. That part is finished. He was quiet. All right, he said finally. They went back inside. She made eggs because she found them in the refrigerator, and the refrigerator was otherwise sparsely populated in the way of a person who has not been cooking with anyone else in mind. He made toast because she asked him to, and because there was something in the asking that required a response in kind. They stood in the kitchen together and made breakfast in the particular way of two people who are figuring out the physical grammar of sharing a space. The slight adjustments, the brief negotiations over counter space, the learning of where the other person is going to be. They ate at the kitchen table. The lake was visible from it. The morning had fully arrived and the light was the good kind. Not harsh, just clear. They didn't talk about the large things during breakfast. They talked about the eggs and whether the toast was too dark, and what the lake did in November when the weather changed, and whether there were books in the house she hadn't read yet. Small architecture, the kind that holds weight without announcing it. After breakfast, she called Noah. He answered on the second ring, which was fast even for Noah. "You found him," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "You good?" She thought about the question seriously for a moment. "Working on it," she said. She paused. "There's not much time." A brief silence. She heard the particular quality of Noah Carter absorbing difficult information and not flinching from it. "I'm sorry," he said. And it was the right kind of sorry. Not performative, just true. "I know." She looked out the kitchen window at the lake. "Thank you for everything. For the mission and for the anomaly and for—" "Don't," he said, and she could hear him almost smiling. "We both know you would have flown the ship back yourself if it came to it." "Probably," she said. "Go be where you need to be," he said. "I'll handle the debrief paperwork. I'll say you're in medical recovery, which isn't technically untrue." "Thank you, Noah." "Call me Thursday," he said, "or whenever." "I will." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the phone in her hands. Ethan was washing the breakfast things at the sink, moving carefully, conserving. She watched him for a moment. "Thursday," she said. "The appointment. What are the options at this stage?" He turned slightly. "Palliative management. Comfort protocols. The treatment window for intervention closed." He paused. "Some time ago." "How long ago?" "The aggressive treatment would have needed to begin at least 4 years ago to have meaningful effect." He turned back to the sink. "I made the calculation." "You made the calculation," she said, "that the foundation work mattered more than the treatment." "Yes." "And now I'm here," she said. He was quiet. "I'm not saying you were wrong," she said. "I'm saying now I'm here and we need to work with what is." She stood up. "The researchers, Garrett and the others. The gravitational corridor technology. If it works at the scale you think it works, it does work. We've proven the principle." "Then the medical research applications," she said. "Targeted delivery systems. Time differential treatment protocols for conditions that advance faster than conventional treatment timelines." She was already thinking. She could hear herself thinking in the way that happened when a problem had a shape she could work with. "I've spent 4 months running calculations in an anomaly corridor. I know things about the time differential physics that your researchers don't have yet because it's experiential data, not theoretical. There are applications. Claire." His voice was gentle but clear. 3 weeks. She stopped. "I'm not a problem you can solve," he said. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, the way he'd always dealt in facts. "I know that's difficult. I know what you do with problems that have shapes you can work with. But this one is what it is." She stood in the kitchen. "Then what do you need?" she said. Not from him. To him. The distinction mattered, and he heard it. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel. He turned. "This," he said. "Just this." She walked to the sink. She stood beside him and looked out the window at the lake. They stood there for a while, both of them, looking at the water. 3 weeks later, 22 days precisely, Noah Carter drove up from the city because Claire had called him on day 20 and said she thought he should come. He arrived in the morning to find the house with the kitchen light on and the south garden visible from the driveway. And he stood for a moment at the car and looked at the house before going in. He stayed for 2 days. On the second evening, he sat with Ethan in the study while Claire was in the garden, and the two men talked for the first time without intermediary, about the mission, about the anomaly, about what the physics actually looked like from inside it, which Ethan wanted to know in the way he'd always wanted to know real things without the softening of official reports. He asked good questions. Noah answered them directly. By the end of it, they had the particular rapport of two people who have different histories of the same woman and have decided to respect each other for it. Before Noah left, he stood in the driveway and Claire stood with him. "You're staying," he said. "Yes." "Good." He looked at the house. "The debrief's going to want you back in about 3 weeks. I bought us some time. Medical grounds, which everyone is too careful to push right now. But eventually." "I know," she said. "I'll be there." He looked at her. "You're going to be all right," he said. Same as he'd said in the anomaly, when the hull was groaning and the math didn't fit. As a statement of intent. "Yes," she said. "I am." He drove away. She stood in the driveway and watched the car until it was gone, and then she turned and went back into the house. She found Ethan in the study. He was at his desk, not working, just sitting, looking at the folder of quarterly reports with his hands flat on the table. She'd noticed he did this sometimes, just sat with it, the evidence of what the years had contained. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside him. They looked at the folder together. "The south wall," she said, next spring. "I think we should add another row. My mother had a second variety that I remember. I think I can find the species." He looked at her. Something in his face that she had spent 34 years learning to read had finally gone completely legible. "Next spring," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm planning ahead." He looked at the folder. He looked at the lake through the study window. He looked at his hands. "You know," he said quietly, "I would go back. If there were a way to go back. To that apartment. To before Vivian, before the decision. I would do it differently." "I know you would," she said. "I would have said it," he said. "That night. Your parents' flowers were—" He stopped. "I would have said it." She put her hand over his on the table, not gently, firmly. The hand of a person who is not managing the moment but living inside it. "You're saying it now," she said. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, the lake in the late afternoon was doing the thing it did. That particular light, that particular color. They sat together in the study with the folder of 18 years' work between them and held on. And the light moved across the water outside, and the house held them the way it had been holding one of them alone for a long time, and was now, finally, doing the thing it had been built for.